Started. We are so glad to see everyone here today. Thank you so much for joining us for Wednesday Gatherings. My name is Kim Schultz, and I'm the coordinator of creative initiatives at CTS. And I'm here, I see, by several of my colleagues, and we are very excited about the conversation that we are all here today to witness and be a part of with Reverend Lillian Daniel and our own Brian Smith. And so we will get to that in a very short while, but I wanted to first start, as we always do, with a little bit of business. And that is to, I think everyone came in the room muted, but do keep yourself muted unless you are speaking, and there will be some time for some dialogue and Q&A after our conversation with Reverend Daniel. So in that case, feel free to unmute yourself to speak. We also do encourage everyone to use the chat to say hello to friends, new and old, and also to ask questions, throw responses in real time in the chat. I will help, as I'm sure Marie will and Brian, to manage the chat. So if you wish to use that feature, please do, and we will refer to that. And I think that might be all the business. Oh, I will note that we are recording, so just so you're aware of that. And we do love seeing faces. So those of you who are able to turn on your cameras, it's so lovely to actually see real people in real time. So if you are able to do that, we do so love that and appreciate that. So I think that is all the business. And now we will, I will introduce Munir Sheikh, who is going to offer our words of gathering, which we start every Wednesday gathering with. Munir is the Vice President of Operations and Academic Affairs at Bayan Islamic Graduate School that we are in partnership with at CTS. Munir is a friend and a colleague and a good man, Munir. How about that for an introduction? And I'm glad to know him. And so Munir, I will pass it to you for our opening words.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'll take that. It's nice to be part of this program today, and Bayan is an Islamic graduate school, so of course, I'm Muslim, and I wanted to share something from the Islamic tradition. Oftentimes, people share, a bit of scripture, or from a Muslim perspective, something from the prophetic tradition. But today, I thought that in lieu of that, I would share something from the broader intellectual and literary heritage of Islamic civilization. Some of you may know of this famous Persian poet named Sa'di. Many people are familiar with Rumi, who is another important figure in Islamic history, but Sa'di was also a quite prolific and imaginative author and poet. So I've selected something from him. He's a 13th century Persian poet from the city of Shiraz in Iran. And he wrote a number of important works that used orchards and flower gardens sort of as the primary framing for his literary compositions, his poetry. I've selected one of his poems to share with you today. And it is called The Pearl. And it's a poem that touches upon the themes of humility as well as self-esteem or self-worth. So here it goes. A single drop of rain fell from a cloud in the sky, but was filled with shame when it saw the sea so wide. Next to the sea, then, who am I? If the sea exists, then how can I? While looking down on itself with the eyes of contempt, an oyster in its shell took it in for nourishment, and so it was that its fate was sealed by this event, and it became a famous pearl to adore a king's head. Having descended to the depths, it was now exalted to the heights. On the portal of non-existence, it went knocking until it finally was transformed into being. Thank you.
Thank you, Munir. That was lovely. Thank you for sharing that and beginning us. Before I introduce my colleague, Reverend Brian Smith, to get into this discussion today, I would just love to offer an opportunity for President Braxton to offer a word of welcome if he sees fit. I see he has joined the call.
Thank you so much, Kim. Just want to say greetings to the CTS family and how delighted I am to be with our good friend and former trustee and my longtime co-conspirator, Dr. Lillian Daniel. Anytime she opens her mouth or writes with her pen or types on her keyboard, it is a monumental moment where wisdom will be shared and truth will be spoken. Sister, you are welcomed in this place today, and we hear you gladly. Thank you.
That's most excellent, Dr. Braxton. Thank you so much for those words. I now would love to introduce Reverend Brian Smith, Brian E. Smith, who is a colleague, also another colleague and dear friend of mine. And Brian is going to be in dialogue with Reverend Daniel today. So I will, Brian serves as the Director of Strategic Partnerships. Did I get that right? I think you maybe have one more word in your title. Yes, okay, at CTS. And we look very forward to this conversation, which is around the idea of purple churches and where we are as a community in terms of building relationship in areas that are maybe not as clear as other areas may be. So I will pass it to Brian and let you take it from here, Brian. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. In the spirit of our dear president, who is, my apologies. In the spirit of our dear president, and again, that's my daughter. Bless her heart. In the spirit of our dear president, who has pricked my consciousness in terms of the value of music and how we relate to gathering, I just want to begin first to acknowledge those.
Brian, we just had a little bit of sound issue. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We just lost some volume. Whatever you just did, we lost some volume. We're having a hard time hearing you. When you first started speaking, it was fine, and then we just lost you.
Okay.
There we are. There we are. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
In the spirit of our president, who encourages us to recognize the value of music, and in light of the various tragedies taking place across the world, I want to begin by speaking peace and offering a song on behalf of those who are dealing with tragedies in Turkey, and those students' families and staff members of Michigan State. So let us pause for a moment as we bring music into this space in order for the Spirit to be present with us. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya. Oh Lord, kumbaya. Someone's praying, my Lord, kumbaya. Someone's praying, my Lord, kumbaya. Someone's praying, my Lord, kumbaya. Oh Lord, kumbaya. Good morning. As we begin, I want to take this time to introduce the Reverend Dr. Lillian Daniel. I'll read a bit from her bio. She is a nationally recognized preacher, teacher, and writer who cares deeply about clergy and congregations. After serving 4 unique congregations in the UCC, she now feels called by the Holy Spirit to leadership as the next conference minister of Michigan. A graduate of Yale Divinity School, she began her ministry as an associate pastor at a large church in Cheshire, Connecticut. From there, she became a solo pastor at a small urban church in New Haven, Connecticut, where the choir outnumbered the congregation. But over 8 years, they grew to become a vibrant interracial community that also became open and affirming. This will be the first of 3 churches to go through the open and affirming process under her pastoral leadership, which also includes extensive experience organizing for justice in politically diverse settings, serving on the boards of Interfaith Worker Justice and the Community Renewal Society. After 10 years as a senior pastor of a large church in the western suburbs of Chicago, she moved to the beautiful Driftless region of Dubuque, Iowa, where she has been senior pastor at a historic urban church since 2016. In the United Church of Christ, she has the distinction of having been a General Synod delegate from all of the 3 conferences she has served: Connecticut, Illinois, and Iowa. A regular writer for the UCC Still Speaking devotionals. She was a founding member of the UCC Writers Group that has produced many written materials for the denomination and in Iowa. She is currently a member of her association's Committee on Ministry. And I'll move to the final part of her bio. Passionate about faith formation for both clergy and laity, Lillian Daniel currently teaches UCC history and polity at Chicago Theological Seminary, where she is also on the board of trustees. She has taught preaching at a number of schools, including University of Chicago, University of Dubuque Theological Seminary, and Yale Divinity School. Although she can't be held responsible for everyone who falls asleep in church, perhaps most importantly, at every church she has served, numerous church members and seminarians have felt the call to become pastors, and they now serve at churches across the world. I present to you Reverend Dr. Lillian Daniel. Dr. Daniel, as we start this conversation, I think we should take a moment to clarify what we mean when we use the term purple churches. And I want you to start the conversation by telling us what this term means and how you would describe a purple church.
Thank you. So generally what we mean when we say a purple church is a combination of red and blue, Republican and Democrat. And, it comes from the news where they'll say, oh, this is a red state, this is a blue state, and this is a purple state. And so I have had the privilege of pastoring purple churches in purple states, although I'll freely admit that in many cases I didn't know that's what I was getting into. The search committee often represents themselves differently. But this particular conversation we're having at the seminary grew out of some conversations I had with President Braxton and also with Professor Christoph Ringer, where I was talking about being in my new role as a conference minister, which for those who are not from the UCC, I have the care and oversight of our 140 congregations in Michigan and the United Church of Christ. A lot of people say, is it like a bishop? And I say, I am like a bishop, but without a carrot and without a stick. So it's an earned soft authority, if that term means anything to you. And a lot of what we do is help churches to find a pastor when they're looking for one. And we also help people along the way in their discernment process toward ordination. And I was talking about what everybody's talking about at judicatory ministry at any denomination, the clergy shortage. It's very real. After COVID, during COVID, we had a lot of pastors resign, but more have resigned since. They got their churches through COVID and they said, you know what, Lord, this is not what I signed up for. And I think it's similar to education, other fields that have experienced this. And so everybody is seeing a shortage of profiles, which is what we in the United Church of Christ call like a minister's resume. We are not having the same number of applicants to open positions. And we are particularly experiencing this, those of us who are in denomination and have territory that is a purple state. And I have jokingly said to President Braxton, when I teach UCC polity, everybody in the class knows what kind of church they want to serve. They want to serve an open and affirming, anti-racist congregation that's done its work, that has a big endowment and is on one of the two coasts. And I'm in Michigan, I got nothing. So I wanted to talk about the joys of pastoring a purple church in a purple state.
And so you and I discussed this article, or I sent an article to you that just came out today from The Guardian, which says that we're losing our religion, why U.S. churches are on the decline. And it says, as the U.S. adjusts to an increasingly non-religious population, thousands of churches are closing each year, probably accelerated by COVID. And so what you've described is sort of a conflation. And I didn't realize that, but it does make sense that now you're having challenges filling pulpits, while also churches are having challenges bringing in membership. So I want to talk about your current ministry context as you have pastored multiple purple churches, but I want to ask you if it's unique relative to the other congregations that you've served.
So I would say, so my brief history of churches I've served is I was raised Episcopalian, but I became United Church of Christ as a young adult, and in seminary pursued an ordination in that. And for those who are not familiar with the UCC, compared to other denominations, we are small, and we are superior and the best. That's really all you need to know. No, I'm teasing, but we tend to be known as a progressive, early and prophetic denomination. We came out early on abolition. We ordained the first woman in this country. We were the first Christian denomination to come out for equality of marriage, long before it was even legal in any states. So that's kind of our branch of the Christian family in the United Church of Christ. And that's us in our PR and on our website, and in the marketing. When you get to our actual congregations, they tend to, like most congregations, represent the setting that they're in. So if you are in a very conservative part of the country, the UCC church in town, it may be the most left-leaning, but depending on where you are, that might mean it's moderate Republicans. And so my first church was in a wealthy suburb in Connecticut that definitely voted Republican. And also, particularly in some of our historic churches, in New England, our churches might be hundreds and hundreds of years old. They might be the oldest standing building in the town, on the town green that was once called the church green. I mean, the founding of some of those New England towns is inseparable from the church being planted there. And so there's a way in which we look progressive and open in many ways, but in some ways we are very traditional in that we have deep history and deep roots. So I came to the UCC through that New England Congregationalism and served one of those historic white clapboard churches, you know, from the 1800s, in a Republican town as an associate minister. And, you know, nobody had told me that there were any UCC churches like that. And so based on my academic experience, certainly. Then I went to solo pastor a church in the city of New Haven that was much more left-leaning, as again, churches in college towns tend to be. And from there, I went to the suburbs of Chicago, which were much more Republican than I had any idea. DuPage County, if you know that means anything to you, not Cook County, big difference. And again, that was a purple church. And then going to Dubuque, Iowa, same thing, a purple church. So in general, in DuPage County, Chicago, if you're familiar with that area, but also in Dubuque, the dominant version of Christianity that people saw was conservative Christianity of one kind or another. In Chicago, it was the mega church, Willow Creek, you know, evangelical sort of conservative model there. In Dubuque, Iowa, Archbishop, heavily Catholic, it was that version of conservative Christianity. So the UCC church is kind of an anomaly there, but we are still made up of the people who live in the town. So we're going to have a mixture of political points of view that is periodically going to be at odds with what is being publicized as our brand.
So what are the unique challenges, especially you coming in with these great ideas and certainly opinions about liberation and what it means? What are the unique challenges that you face pastoring these kinds of congregations?
So I think that our nation is at a a nadir, a low point in terms of political discourse and just human behavior toward each other. And I'm putting aside questions of the violence we do to each other and economics. I'm just talking about, we're just at a low point in our level of public discourse. It is at such a low level. And it's like the junior high bullies have taken over. And I would say on both sides, I'm going to be honest and say that. And I think that the pandemic made it worse. We were already siloed, but then we were separated from each other. We went down our rabbit holes. And then Satan, just to be extra mean, sent us down into isolation with our cell phones and computers so we could go really nuts. And we're still climbing out of that ditch. And we don't know how to behave with each other. And we have forgotten that people who have different ideas about the role of government in terms of caring for the poor are not our enemy. But it was interesting to me, and part of why I want to have this conversation in a seminary and clergy setting is that I felt, looking back, I was utterly unprepared for that. Coming out of seminary, I thought everybody agreed in the same vision for the church. And I got to this church in Cheshire, my first church, and they said, being business people, they said, what are the best practices around fundraising and church growth? We're so excited to have you as a recent graduate. And I said, I got nothing. What do you want to know about St. Augustine? And they were not particularly interested, So, and I also want to note this, just let's get controversial. I think even within our denominational systems, in my system, the UCC, we tend to praise churches publicly who match the stated political views of the denomination or what have you, and that churches that don't fit in that do not get praised in the same way. So, for example, in the United Church of Christ, we give a lot of praise to churches that have become open and affirming. And I've led 3 churches through that process. I believe in it. What I don't believe in is that that's the only criteria for which churches should be recognized. So these are the kind of questions that come up when you're the actual pastor. And heaven forbid you bring your church members to our national gatherings and they hear all those resolutions that are getting passed, and they come back and say, is there room for me in this church? Where do I fit?
So as I'm listening to you, and I'm a product of the Black church, and I serve quite a number through CTS. And a lot of times people don't realize that even within the Black church, we have this diversity of opinions. We have different varying levels of conservatism. However, when it comes to issues of civil rights and social justice, we would probably appear to be on the spectrum of being liberal. Do you see that kind of dichotomy in your congregations and then in what we call the Purple Church?
Absolutely, I do. Absolutely, I do. But I also think COVID revealed to many of our churches that there was more political diversity than they knew. When we got down to, we thought, well, surely we can all agree on X, Y, and Z. And it turns out that some people are getting their information from A, B, and C, and D. And we weren't in agreement. Within the Michigan Conference, we have historically Black congregations that I was talking to some pastors who during COVID found out, one example would be, we have one congregation that's a relatively newer one, and it's got a kind of Pentecostal vibe, Black church that is made up majority of lesbians and trans folks from Detroit, right? And within that church, where the members presumed there was a certain similar point of view because they were so united around making space for queer people and the Black experience, found out in COVID that they had radically different ideas around vaccinations, for example, and the role of the government. So yes, those things are true. I think that one way this comes out, though, is right now the issue of inclusion. The inclusion of the queer community. Do you do same-sex marriage or not? that's a key differentiator for churches. And I think that the people who leave your church over that probably needed to leave. They can go to the other 99% of the churches, like if they, but a lot of times what you have are people who believe in that inclusion, for example, or as you said, Pastor, believe in civil rights and its value, but would, for example, have very different views on the role of government in terms of how to work on poverty, or, for example, the role of government during a public health crisis.
So I have an interesting, and this is something I was thinking about as well. Dr. Terrell asks a question in the chat, and I was wondering as well, you listed the main criteria by which folks define their churches as good churches. What are the other criteria for recognition by the denomination? What else makes you a great congregation?
All right, so I'm editorializing here. What if there was a representative from the national church here, they would say it's not at all true that that's the only criteria we recognize. But a lot of times that is who's recognized at national gatherings, et cetera. And I think, as always in churches, we are swinging on pendulums to repent and ask forgiveness for sins of the past. So perhaps there was a day back in the day when our churches were all bigger, and we tended to praise the congregations with the biggest membership and the most money, and acted like whoever was the leader of that church was some kind of a genius, and the traditional tall steeple church, if you will. And I've pastored churches like that would meet that criteria. And I think there was an appropriate correction against that, and saying that's not the be all and end all. And numbers aren't the only way to measure a church. And a lot of times a church grows simply because the neighborhood around it grows, for example. And a lot of times a church shrinks because of similar shifts that are out of control of the pastor. And also just looking at it historically, surely it wasn't the case that in the 60s and the 70s, all of our large churches were filled with geniuses. And since then, all their pastors have been incompetent. There are larger forces at work, but we have tried to correct from the days where that's who got all the attention, right? And so we recognize churches for taking courageous stands, such as open and affirming, or working on anti-racism, or other things like that. And in the UCC, we probably perhaps disproportionately do that because that's kind of our role in the Christian family.
So have you had to take an unpopular stance, one that would not necessarily get you brownie points, but one that you were truly convicted to follow in your leadership of a congregation? Could you talk about that? Yeah,
I mean, we all do, right? And so we all know that there are moments where if the congregation as a whole is going to pursue a project or a mission that is going to alienate politically, a chunk of the congregation, what do you do? So, for example, in the open and affirming process, you literally take a vote and you become open and affirming, and there will be people who are going to leave the congregation at that point. That will happen. But what I want to talk about is that more subtle gray area that so many new pastors find themselves in, where they'll be at a church and they'll be preaching their hearts out, and they'll have members say, we're just not connecting with your preaching. Or, it's kind of a downer. And eventually that pastor, is trying to get to the bottom of what's wrong with it, and it'll come out, well, it just seems like you talk a lot about race.
Yes.
And it's just kind of a downer, or whatever it is, right? And by the way, nobody ever comes to the pastor and says, here are my clearly stated political views and why I disagree with the ones you expressed. Instead, they come and they say, it's not me, but just people in general are not appreciating your messages.
Interesting. And does that tend to happen when you bring up matters of race and social justice versus talking about personal piety? Because that's something that I think many congregations wrestle with this idea of focusing on community versus focusing on me and my personal salvation.
Yeah, so in the United Church of Christ, we don't spend a lot of time on personal salvation. I wish we did. Personally, but that's my editorial comment. But generally, if you go to a UCC church, I mean, you know that these are tending to be kind of heady people who want to engage the issues of the day until you hit one they don't agree with you on. And so every denomination sort of has some brand, if you will. And so generally in my churches, when the Republicans have said we don't feel heard, this and that, they are aware that they might be in a minority in a church. Maybe it's a 48% minority, but they're aware that within the national setting of the UCC, they might not align politically. And generally, I think they're thoughtful folks who still are getting something meaningful out of this church. If they wanted to go to church where they just hear their own politics spouted back to them and wrapped up in a Jesus loves you and name it and claim it and, prosperity is yours, then they could do that. So they're clearly wanting something, that they're getting in this community. But I think there are times when we get in trouble as preachers, and particularly new preachers, is when we make a statement like that in a way that comes off as assumptive or dismissive. For example, a new pastor, in Michigan, refers to radical right-wing extremists, and it's clear in the way she's talking about them that she doesn't think they're in the room with her. And they don't know how to address that with her, and she may not know that they're there. And they're like, but I think you mean us, I think you mean us. So a lot of times it's just, if every pastor would just remember that whenever we talk about whoever a they is, we should imagine that that person and their cousins are sitting in church that day. Then how do you talk about it?
So that it's a matter of sensitivity, not running away from the truth, but understanding that you're dealing with another person with feelings. And go ahead.
Yeah, a thoughtful human being, a person who wrestles with their own faith. Like if they are more conservative in the stance of the denomination and they're still there, there's probably a reason for it. And but they don't want their humanity dismissed or to be talked down to. That's the other mistake we make. If we use a mocking tone, which I have done, thinking I was being humorous, often our humor cuts very deeply when people perceive we're being condescending. On the flip side, and this is my pitch to get CTS graduates to come serve churches in Michigan, is I think that Jesus, I know Jesus dealt with a purple world. I mean, Jesus is always going to sit with outsiders and people who others find offensive and morally bankrupt. And he is always just living that out. And he's not only going to eat with them, he's bringing his own disciples who don't want to eat with those people to eat with them too. And so in our political climate right now, which is so negative, I think churches might be the only places, maybe other than schools, where we sit next to people with different political points of view and see them as human beings. So I think that among liberals and conservatives who are not extremists, but fall somewhere in that 80% middle, there's a hunger to be a part of spaces where they're not just listening to their own point of view. They don't necessarily want to come to church and have you stage political debates for them, but they want to believe that there are purple places where you can serve God and neighbor. I see some questions about resourcing. There are a number of them. I'm not going to try to throw them online here, but what I think I want to talk about is, yeah, how do pastors navigate this, and how does our language matter when we do this? So one of the things I learned when I realized I'd accidentally moved to a purple church, and after crying over it for a while and whining about it, I thought, oh, maybe God meant for me to be here. And another thing I realized too was that I had to really look at my own judgmentalism. So, when I moved to Chicago many years ago, I had in mind exactly what everyone had. I was pastoring a progressive, open-minded church in a university town in New Haven, Connecticut. And I wanted one just like that in Chicago, just a little bigger, a little richer, and a little more enlightened. That's all I asked. And I wanted to be in the city of Chicago too. And I didn't get it. Instead, I had large multi-staff churches from the suburbs, who are rich, who didn't agree with me, who kept asking me to consider position their church. And it took me a minute, but I finally said, oh my Lord, these conservative rich people are much more open-minded toward me than I'm being toward them.
Wow.
And that's where I thought, maybe I'm a missionary, and I'm called upon to have some courage and go to a land that I don't want to live in.
Wow. That's an interesting perspective, almost a Jonah-like experience, being sent where you don't necessarily desire to go. And there's an interesting question here Yvonne raises. What would churches that truly affirm and practice the separation of church and state look like? And can you distinguish polity and politics, and whether they meet at the intersection of justice?
So that's it. So the separation of church and state is a state issue. This is, I think, important to say. For pastors, nothing is off limits to us if we are preaching the gospel. So if the scripture points toward the issues of the day, it is not political to use what's happening in the political and public space in your sermons if you're being led to do so by the readings. So in other words, the tail can't wag the dog. You can't say, today I'm going to really tell the congregation what should be done in the aftermath of Tyree Nichols' video being released. And then I'm going to flip through the Bible or my phone and look for some scripture to sprinkle on top of it like a condiment. That's that's proof texting as bad as other people do it, right? But isn't it remarkable, pastors and preachers, how when you're looking at the text from which you preach, they seem to be speaking exactly toward the release of the video in Memphis, right? I mean, but it has to grow out of that. And then I think people, and I also think, if the video in Memphis has just been released and you don't say anything about it, to me, that is strange. To me, that is strange. But how do you talk about it then? And even the use of pronouns, such as like we know or let us. We're not the royal family. We got to drop the royal we. We don't know who is listening to us in church or online. So we got to drop that we and they language and maybe use more of the second person you. I would love to see more. So you can say, well, some of you think this, and maybe some of you wonder this, and some of you are in the middle. And just to sort of state that as part of your preaching. And I think when you do that, the congregation breathes a sigh of relief and says, oh my goodness, I'm seen here. I'm noticed. I don't think it means the pastor has to then say, and I'm somewhere in the middle, I'm Switzerland, but I think to acknowledge some say this, some say that, seems like Jesus might be saying this. What do you think?
So, as you speak about preaching and the way we reflect during preaching, I just want to bring up your sermon. I listened to it in its entirety. I think it was Easter Sunday, and you were preaching about the sudden nature that was exhibited, I believe, in the book of Matthew. Things were happening suddenly. And then you gave this marvelous description about how time impacts us and how we perceive things. And so you talked about coming through divinity school, and those before you were saying, well, you know, it was like this and it was great, and you missed out. And so you had your experience. But then as you grew in ministry and people came to you about new ways of learning, particularly online, you were like, well, you know what? You missed out because we did it this way. And so I really want you to talk about that. And I want to go into Dr. Terrell's question. In what ways do we try to mitigate the nearing post-COVID church in purple churches, given that brilliant perspective that you offered in the sermon about how we perceive time?
So one of the realities of COVID is that we don't know how it's affected churches. We just know it has. And it's so the sermon that I'm preaching at all the churches in Michigan as I go around to visit is the Good Samaritan. And I talk about how, in a sense, the last couple of years, the church has been in the ditch. We've been in the ditch, you know, injured, broken, what happened to us, you know, and we're trying to get out of the ditch, right? And how do we get out of the ditch? But also, what did we learn in the ditch? Because the ditch is where strong things grow, like ditch lilies. And if you're from Iowa, ditch asparagus tastes better than any asparagus you grow elsewhere. And, you know, there's like power in the ditch, right? And one of the things I think we learned, but I hope we remember it, is that none of us were right about COVID. Nobody had the crystal ball. And yet so many of us are dug in and are still waiting to be proven right. And, you know, Jesus has something to say about that attitude. And it's not favorable. But to just be able to say, you know what, looking back on the last couple of years, there were precautions that I did not take, that looking back, I realized I should have taken earlier. And I asked forgiveness for that. And yet there were other precautions that I was sure we needed to take. And looking back, it was a little bit like wearing garlic around my neck and trying to keep the vampires away. You know, to admit that we were all doing the best we could, and that, you know, small groups of us were huddled together trying to make decisions in our bubbles, and to release the idea of having to have been proven right on what was a mysterious and is a mysterious pandemic, you know, and if the can't model some level of humility around that, heaven help us.
You expressed that in your sermon with respect to COVID, when you said, you know, you were not a big fan of online education, and then COVID came, and then you realized those individuals were prepared. And then you even brought up CTS. You gave us a wonderful plug. And you talked about how when the idea of online education was presented to you, you said, no way, but it is the theme. And here we are online.
Dr. Alex Jean-Charles is your chief missionary and converted me. He converted me. But no, absolutely. And again, for us in the church to model learning and growth, whereas what I worry about that we're doing is we're modeling I told you so behavior, and who turns out to be right. So the article in The Guardian that Pastor referenced, it lays out what it is true that they've studied it. Those churches in states that did not shut down, or churches that chose not to shut down, you know, in the early days of COVID, there were terrible stories about people who got COVID from funerals and churches that were open, mega churches, you know, and they died. And, you know, that was awful. But I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but were there some people who experienced a little bit of theological schadenfreude and said, I told you so, you know, see, we were right, right? But then later today, right, they've done studies, and some of the churches that reopened earlier than others have had less of a drop in their attendance. Now, sociologists are going to debate that from 20 years from now and find out all kinds of other factors were involved, et cetera, et cetera. But I can tell you just anecdotally, it is true that the longer a church stayed closed, the slower people were to come back. And you could say, what came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, were these cautious people to begin with, et cetera? But I mean, you know, there's going to be some I told you so and on all sides. And if we in the Christian family can't say, we're just going to decide, we're just going to quit doing that. And we're going to say, how do we move forward?
Mhm.
You know,
I've seen some requests in the chat. I don't know, Reverend, if you have it. I've got multiple computers going, but there's some people that want a copy of that article.
if you talk for a minute, I'll find it.
Hey, not a problem. Understood. And I will talk about this as well as we re-engage. I pastor a small congregation, and what I have noticed is that I have more young people coming, and it's a gift, and they love the online, and people love the fact that they don't have to get their hair done, and they can just come in and worship and be a part of it, and then go back to bed. So I want to ask you if you've noticed any changes with the young people that you have contact with in your congregational setting, in these purple settings. What's happening with young people? And, you know, I allow you to determine what age is young.
Sure. So this is interesting. So across our churches, and I think this is even denominations, as people return to in-person worship, we are also receiving incredible affirmation for the power of online worship, and nobody should stop doing that. It would be as crazy as deciding to lock your door on Sunday, right? It would make no sense. But periodically, church members will say, if we just quit doing the online worship, then all those lazy good-for-nothings would get off their couch and change out of their pajamas and come to church like the Lord intended, you know? But the online stuff is here to stay. It's so important. And everybody, if they ever visit you in person, they visited you 10 times online. But what we're seeing is this. We're seeing, I think, people now have multiple loyalties and real commitments to multiple congregations because of who they connected with online. So you could have people who love and even financially support your church, who are also connected to other church or no church or might be across the world, you know, that's one thing. But in the sort of who's missing category, it's definitely parents of young children. I mean, that's the group that is slowest to come back. And I think we all can understand why. I think many groups were traumatized. Most of all, those who lost a beloved family member or worked, you know, in ways in which their health was endangered, be it healthcare workers or all those people who were delivering Amazon packages and food so the rest of us could be locked down, right? You know, there were people whose lives were at risk. But the other group who was traumatized was parents of young children who suddenly were trying to keep up with jobs and be school teachers and deal with their kids. And we're going to see, you know, millions of children who lost 2 years of school versus the gap between the haves and the have-nots is huge on this, you know, but also just parents. I think parents are traumatized and they haven't even been able to tend to their own relationships, their sense of shame, whether they were doing enough, et cetera, their guilt, you know, and so they have become really choosy and their kids have become really choosy about what do I have to do and what do I not have to do. And I was talking recently to a football coach at a winning high school, right? One of my Republican church members. And he said, you know, school sports are going through this.
Yes.
Like school sports aren't having kids sign up. Everybody's gotten a lot more discerning, but also just, I think they're exhausted. So that's the one story is like churches say, we're not seeing our young people. But there's another story I'm hearing in Michigan, which is for families who might have been attending a denomination or church that did not really align with their values, but were doing so because, you know, that was one all the kids went to or we've always been Christian Reformed for 6 generations and we're Dutch or whatever it is. COVID and that gap gave them an opportunity to say, what did we miss? And do we want to perhaps find a different kind of church? So while churches are grieving, they're missing their families, there are new families that are checking them out online and in person. And a lot of those families, they are using the criteria of help me, Christian church, navigate this incredibly new world of gender and human sexuality and identity and pronouns and life that my kids are living with. Help me put that and live that out in a safe Christian context. And if we can be ready to welcome folks like that, it's an amazing opportunity, because it's a huge reshuffling that's going on right now.
I have a question for you as we near the end of our session. I'm so deeply encouraged. And I want to ask you, as we navigate this purple scenario, how do you remain truthful to central tenets of your faith? How do you make sure that while you are inviting and while you treat everybody with love, you still lift up a standard that you know to be true?
So, it's so funny how God works, right? And the Holy Spirit works. I mean, we set this program up months and months ago on the calendar. And then here I am talking to you 2 days after a mass shooting in East Lansing at Michigan State University, And that night when all that was unfolding in the news, I was calling our pastors, and they were on lockdown in their own homes, in their basements. Some of them could see the sirens out their windows. Others had people locked in their churches, and this was when we didn't know where the shooter was and the extent. This is obviously hot button political territory, because as surely as to me personally, I look at this and I say, I am angry. Why can't we get this together? All these school shootings, this is an obvious, argument for gun control. But because as a pastor, especially as a conference minister, I force myself to watch Fox News and get my news from a variety of sources. I knew that there's a whole other half of the country that is saying this tragedy is such confirmation of our belief in allowing people to conceal or carry firearms. And, if one of those students had a handgun, they could have stopped this guy, right, from killing more than one, and it's just as obvious to them, right? And so how do you address that? And I had the task of, I realized I had to write a pastoral reflection or theological reflection to our churches, and what do you say in that is more than just our thoughts and prayers are with you? Because, this is I love the anger of, it's mostly secular people who are coming back and saying, don't say your thoughts and prayers are with us, and they look at Christianity and think, because that's all you do. That's all you do, right? And so, if I may, I posted a link to the thing I end up writing, but if I can, I want to read you a little piece of it and just talk about how I thought of it in light of being in a purple church, right? So one point of view is you just say nothing that's going to offend anyone. Our prayers are with you. Thoughts and prayers are with you. We love you all, Another is that you go full on, like, let me tell you why I'm right about gun control. That's an option, et cetera. But but I was also aware, we live in a political world, right? That the shooting of, relatively privileged college students in Michigan got so much more airtime on the news. I mean, there are groups of young people getting shot all the time in this country, and it's not getting the attention that Michigan State got, right? So, you're navigating all those things. And so I decided in a sense to go theological, to not begin in the news, but to go theological and to address the question that I think people are looking for from pastors, where they say, how did God let this happen? Right. So I said, and also to give some hope. So I said, as every pastor knows, when tragedy hits, our churches grow much larger than our membership rolls. They become centers of care for the whole community. When violence locks us down or sends us into the streets, the church has the chance to blast its walls. And when preachers may realize their most important sermon may be the one that is offered to a stranger at the grocery store who recognizes them and says, Pastor, just answer me this, how did God let this happen? And I've heard that question a lot lately from people who are horrified by whatever picture of the world they receive in the news of their own choosing. But it's a question that we in the church have a theological answer to. God does not let this happen. People do. It is people who let these things happen. We saw it in the video of Tyree Nichols, killed by the brutality of human violence and the more devastating brutality of human indifference. We see it in the horror of the war in Ukraine, whereas in all wars, the poor pay the greatest price, while far away leaders philosophize to monetize their own safety. We see it in ourselves as a country when the news of one school shooting after another becomes routine, in a culture drooling for violence as entertainment, but hardened to it in real life. We see it in ourselves as a nation of immature impulses and short attention spans, more interested in shooting balloons out of the sky than taking guns out of the hands of its own people. God does not allow that to happen. People do. Yet somehow, despite the stakes, God, the great creator of all things, chose to create us with free will and mortal bodies. We could have been made to live forever as coddled infants, with our needs met, our decisions constrained, and our capacity to harm the rest of creation minimized. Instead, we were created in the image of God, which means we have souls and bodies that were literally built for growth and change. Created with a limited time on earth, we were given the ability to choose between right and wrong, love or death, God or stuff, the care of all creation, or the tedious worship of the self, all on a short journey through life whose purpose is to draw us closer to the one who gave us life to begin with. As for the shooting in East Lansing, God does not let this happen. People do. It is God's people who let the worst things happen to ourselves and to one another, from the violent act of taking lives to the violent inaction of cynical indifference. But it is also God's people who allow the most beautiful things to happen, from the courageous saving of lives to the loving healing of broken spirits, to the humble repairing of the world from our own mistakes. This is what it means to follow Jesus, human and divine. And today, our Michigan pastors and churches are at the beating heart of it all.
Amen. And what a fitting closing statement. Thank you so much, Reverend, for your transparency, your humility, and your honesty in sharing with us during this time. And God bless your ministry. We are now going to move forward. I guess I will return the session to my colleague, Kim Schultz, as we close for this afternoon. Okay.
Brendan, excuse me, Brian, I think Kim had to leave in the middle. So we just want to have everyone looking for further information, etc. Hi, Rana. About upcoming events, to go to ctschicago.edu/events. We have the annual Interreligious Lecoq lecture coming up March 16th, and that will be on Zoom, and many other things coming up soon. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. It's so good to see you. Be well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Blessings, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend. Thank you.
Thank you, CTS.